Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
So there's a puzzling incident in this week's Parashat. And I have to say that some of the puzzlement comes from the ambiguity of the Hebrew word lishol, because lishol means to ask or to ask for, but it also can, in certain contexts, mean to borrow. Okay, so, and many of the translators translate the particular verb as borrow, and that's how I've always understood it. But I think upon delving a little bit deeper and further reflection, it's not borrow, it really is to ask. Okay, so what am I talking about, right? So prior to the Exodus, Israelite women are told, go to their Egyptian neighbors and lishol, okay? So to ask or to borrow silver and gold and clothing. And then when they leave Egypt, they take these items with them. Okay, and so early in this parsha, the Lord says to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here, and when he does, he will drive you out completely. Tell the people that men and women alike are to ask their neighbors for articles of silver and gold. And then later on in the parasha, and this is a section that we read this morning, the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise they said, we will all die. So the people took their dough before it could leaven and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for. Okay, and Rabbi Jonathan Sachs asked a lot of questions about this, right? I mean, first of all, they're in a hurry to leave, that they can't wait for the dough to leaven. Okay, and here I have to clear up a misconception. We're not talking about yeast. Okay, at this point in human development, people had not isolated yeast and adding it to dough. Okay, either, I mean, and if you are a winemaker or maybe a baker, you know that there's yeast in the air everywhere. Okay, I mean, and I used to make wine, and you had to be really, really careful to make sure that the unfermented grape juice was covered and protected, because otherwise yeast from the air could just get in and start a fermentation process that was not necessarily desirable. So we're not talking about yeast, what we're talking about is sourdough, right? Which originally occurs from naturally occurring yeast, and then you take some of that starter and you add it. I mean, I've never done that, but probably some of you have, right? And so that takes time, right? And if it takes so much time that you don't have time even to let your dough ferment, but you have time to take silver and gold, right? And where are they going? They're going to the desert, right? If I am planning on a trip to the desert and I've got to figure out what to take with me, I'm not sure silver and gold are at the top of my list, right? They have very limited utility in the desert, right? And so in the Talmud, after the incident of the golden calf, right, exactly, that's what they use it for. So Moses says to God, because, we're allowed to have chutzpah with God, right? Moses says to God, hey, look, God, this whole thing is your fault, right? You told them to ask for gold and silver from the Egyptians, and they used that gold to make the golden calf, but they only had that gold because you told them. If you hadn't told them to ask for the gold, they would maybe have wanted to make the golden calf, but they wouldn't have been able to make the golden calf because they wouldn't have any gold. Right? So this whole thing is really your fault. So why does God tell them to ask for gold? Yeah.
Well, I can think of two things. Number one, gold and silver would be a status symbol, and since you were slaves, now you're free, it gives you a different mindset, but also, if God knows what's going to happen, maybe he's testing them to see what they might do with the gold in certain situations.
Okay, so all right, Jacob, I'll get to you in a second. You made 2 points. One is a status symbol, the other is if God is testing them, okay? I'll get to your second point first. If God is testing them and God knows everything, then God also knows the result of the test. So the test is superb, right? But the status symbol, yeah, possibly. I mean, one of the theories about tzitzit is that only nobles were allowed to have fringes on their garments. So we have fringes on our garments as a status symbol. That's speculation, but in terms of the Kehilat, the blue thread, that's not speculation. That was definitely right, not easy to have, and in the Roman Empire reserved specifically for royalty. Okay, so the status symbol part, yeah, absolutely, Jacob.
To say, gold and silver were very important for the Mishkan, right?
Well, okay, right, the gold and silver were important in the construction of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, but the construction of the Mishkan was only in response to the sin of the golden calf, right? It was God saying, okay, your intentions are good, but your execution is flawed, right? So instead of this calf, build this Mishkan, right? So again, had they not had the gold in the first place, no sin of the golden calf, and therefore no need for the Mishkan, at least the way I see it. Okay, anyone else? I mean, this is great. It's nice that, yeah. All right, 1, 2, 3.
I think it had something to do with, not what it meant for the Jews, but what it meant for the Egyptians that were giving the Jews the gold.
Say more.
That I don't remember why that is.
Okay, all right, so it's not so much because of us, it's because of the Egyptians, right? It means something for them, yeah.
Was thinking that once they got to the desert, they got something to trade with locals in case they need to get things.
Okay, so, right, so gold maybe not useful per se in the desert for itself, but useful as a means of trade, right? Because the desert is not empty, right? There are other groups in the desert as well that they might encounter and maybe want to use for trade. Yeah, Jeff.
They didn't have the gold and silver until they're going down. God forbid what pagan rituals they had engaged in instead.
Ah, okay, that's an excellent point, right? If they didn't have the silver and gold for the golden calf, what other pagan rituals might they have come up with? Right? That's a good point. That's a good point. All right, so here's what a lot of the commentators say. And so I want to look at, actually, this is in our Eitz Chaim. And it is a comment from Beno Yaakov, who was one of the great German Bible commentators. And some of you may have heard of Rabbi Walter Jacob, who was a rabbi in Pittsburgh for a long time. He was Walter Jacob. His father was Beno Yaakov because lived in Germany, right? But it's important to point out that Beno Yaakov, who wrote the commentary that I'm about to share, grew up in Germany and had to escape to England after the Nazis, may their memory be blotted out, came to power. Okay, and here's what he says. The silver and gold given, not lent, given by the Egyptians constituted a protest against the policies of the royal tyrant. They demonstrated a renewal of public conscience. Similar gifts were given to the Jews leaving Babylonia to return to Judea. Had the Israelites left Egypt with nothing after so many years of suffering, the hatred in their hearts toward the Egyptians would have been never ending. The Torah wanted the Egyptian people to send them off with gifts so that it would be easier for the Israelites to fulfill the mitzvah, you shall not abhor or hate an Egyptian, which comes in Deuteronomy, right? We are commanded not to hate Egyptians. All right, and so Rabbi Harold Kushner writes about Rabbi Beno Yaakov's comment here. He understood that the purpose of the commandment was to cleanse our memory of bitterness and hatred. Okay, and Rabbi Sachs says something very, very similar, right? That we have this commandment not to hate the Egyptian, right? And so Beno Yaakov connected this to the gifts that the Israelites got when leaving Babylonia. Rabbi Sachs connects it. There is a mitzvah that if you have an indentured servant, when they go free, you have to give them gifts also. And the point is that there not be hatred in their heart. And here's what Rabbi Sachs writes. And I think it's incontrovertible. A people driven by hate is not and cannot be free. Had the people carried with them a burden of hatred and a desire for revenge, Moses would have taken the Israelites out of Egypt, but he would not have taken Egypt out of the Israelites. They would still be there, bound by chains of anger, as restricting as any metal. to be free, you have to let go of hate. Right? In other words, a society that's based on hatred is not a free society. And a person who lives with hatred is not a free person, right? And how many times you hear the phrase, you're letting them live rent-free in your head, right? You're letting them live rent-free in your head. You have to let it go, right? Because hating another person, it's not that it's bad for that person. It's bad for you, right? And this commandment, because we're also told, it's very interesting. Do not hate your brother in your heart. Then it says, you shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. Right? What does that mean? You're not allowed to hate him or her, but you have to rebuke them. And then you won't bear. In other words, here's what I think it means. Okay, it's a very, very difficult mitzvah. I can hate what you do, but I can't hate you. I can hate the policies you support. Sometimes I think it's a mitzvah to hate the policies you support, but I can't hate you, right? And that is the point, right? We can hate what the Egyptians did to our people, but we can't hate the Egyptians, right? And to make that easier, right, there's, if you will, dirty word sometimes, reparations, right? And it's not even because really for the Egyptians, okay? And it's really for us to purge our own psyches of hatred, right? And this is a very, very difficult thing because we're also commanded to remember, right? We have several times in this parasha the commandment to do this or that thing to remember the Exodus, right? Our children are going to ask, hey, what is this about? And we're told because of the Exodus, right? We have to remember. And when do we remember the Exodus? Pesach, only Pesach? Every day, right? I mean, Shirat Hayam. I mean, most of us don't actually do this, right? But we read Shirat Hayam in the davening every day. Mi Chamocha is in the davening twice a day, right? We say Kiddush, right? Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim, a remembrance of the Exodus. We live our whole lives as Jews with the memory of the Exodus. But it's not so that we can hate the Egyptians. It's not because of the past, it's because of the future, right? What is the most repeated commandment in the Torah. Okay, and I find it interesting, especially if you're into gematria, the importance of numbers. Do not oppress the stranger. Another word for stranger, by the way, ger, the word immigrant, right? Do not oppress the immigrant because you were immigrants in Egypt and you know the heart of the immigrant. 36 times this is repeated in the Torah. Double high, right? So the lesson of the Exodus isn't hate Egyptians. The Exodus is do the opposite of what was done to you. Remember the past to do the opposite of what was done to you. You were oppressed because you were an immigrant. You were oppressed because you were a foreigner. You were oppressed because you were a stranger. You were part of a whole society that was based on that. Don't do those things. 36 times. 36 times, right? And I have to say, a few years ago, Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, the most prominent conservative rabbis in the country, said the tragedy of our times is that if you give a sermon on the importance of being a mensch, you're accused of talking politics from the bima, right? And I want to say, if you give a sermon saying the Torah teaches us not to oppress immigrants, you're giving a political sermon. I'm not giving a political sermon. I'm giving a Torah sermon. Okay? And if you have a problem with the commandment not to oppress the stranger, take it up with God. Don't take it up with me, because I'm not the one who put it in the Torah 36 times. God is the one who put it in the Torah 36 times, right? We are commanded to remember in order not to hate, right? And like Hillel said, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor, right? The famous statement, if you don't remember the past, you're destined to repeat it. We're commanded to remember the past so that we don't repeat it. Remember so that we don't hate, right? And this means drawing a line over the resentments of the past, right? We have to take concrete steps to prevent us from hating, and not because hating is bad for the people that we hate, although often it can be, right? But when your soul is consumed with hatred, it poisons your soul. It poisons your soul. And if you care at all about spirituality, and I don't care which side of the political divide you're on, right? Because one of our problems is that all over society is filled with hatred, right? So this has to, I mean, and I speak very personally, this has to be my mantra. I will hate what you do, but I will not hate you. Right? I will hate what you do, but I will not hate you because it's bad for me. It's bad for my soul. And this, I think, is one of the key things in our Parsha this week. Shabbat Shalom.
Rabbi,
Yeah,
uh, I just want to express a personal opinion. Is there not a connection with Yom Kippur and the practice of apologizing or seeking to reconcile over a difference? The issue of the person being humble enough to bring forward the apology and the recipient to be mensch enough to accept it?
yeah, I mean, right, that's like a key teaching, right? To be willing to apologize and acknowledge wrong, and then on the other side, to be willing to accept the apology. Absolutely. I mean, that unfortunately between the Israelites and the Egyptians didn't come, but I'll wrap up with this. There is something elsewhere in the commentary on the parasha, right? And this is about the importance of not painting with a broad brush, right? It says that there were, and it's connected also to this business of the gifts, right? That there were three groups, a third within Egypt, right? There were a third of the Egyptians who supported the enslavement of the Israelites. They died in the plagues, right? There was another third who opposed. They were the ones who gave the gifts. And then there was a third who so identified with the Israelites that they left with them, and this is the mixed multitude, right? So 2/3 of the Egyptians actually did not support the oppression of the Hebrews, according to this commentary. And I guess the 1/3 who did, there was no possibility of reconciliation anyway, because they died in the plagues. All right. Yeah.